So I suggest starting our session. That's the last one for today's forum. Although it's the last, but it's really relevant for both foreign business represented here and for our local Ukrainian businesses. I hope today we'll hear pros and contras. The existence of competition compliance programs for businesses. I want to say that during the last several years, at least the last 3 or 4 years, the competition compliance session is always in agendas of the fora, and we are thankful to organizers and the regulators, which means that the regulator is well aware of importance and relevance of this topic. Today we have here several speakers from both corporate sector, foreign companies represented in Ukraine, and domestic companies, and also representatives of two regulators, United States and Italy, who will share their thoughts, maybe some practical advices, their opinions concerning this matter. Well, the relevance of competition compliance programs probably gains more and more importance, and the number of these programs is increasing. That's what we can observe. Just because of practices of the regulators, we can see they apply penalties. The penalties are significant. The legislation changes, and we expect some initiatives to amend the competition laws so that the very notion of the competition compliance is clearly defined in the legislation. We expect there will be some guidelines also from the regulator concerning the recommended at least compliance programs that businesses should have, and the best case scenario is to actually force our regulator, or to make our regulator to take into consideration existence of such program within the businesses. And I think the regulator will share their opinion for purposes of penalizing companies, etc. The regulators from different jurisdictions have different opinions. I mean, around the world, these programs can be just a neutral factor, or maybe maybe mitigating factor for purposes of investigation. There are some specific examples which the esteemed US and Italian regulators will share, because there are jurisdictions where the presence of effective and implemented compliance programs within the business shall be taken into consideration by the regulator for penalizing purposes. The position of the Commission did not deem such programs sufficient to release some penalties, and actually their idea was that you have this program, you say it's operational, so how come it didn't work under these circumstances, and you still violated the rules? So probably your program is not good, and we will just ignore the fact that you have such a program. But that was the old position of the European Commission. Now it tends to change to rather positive message and support, and actually fostering the idea of expansion and existence of such programs. Maybe somebody will speak on behalf of our regulator about the current position. Their current position in absence of this notion of compliance programs, would they take into consideration the fact that the company has such compliance programs in their agenda and can prove that this program is being implemented and the people get trained? Would the Anti-Monopoly Committee take into account this fact? Again, for sanctioning purposes, because you remember that the recommendations concerning the penalties state that one of the mitigating factors would be the evidence that confirms the corrections of the violations identified during the inspection. So maybe that's an option, and the existence of such program can be deemed as an attempt to correct the violation. Also, there is point 18. The recommendation includes the non-exhaustive list of the mitigating circumstances. So we'd like to hear from the AMC what is their opinion concerning the companies that have the compliance programs, if these companies are investigated. And let me introduce the speakers. The first speaker is Brian Telpner from Federal Trade Commission of the United States, and Brian will tell us about the elements of an effective compliance program based on the U.S. experience. Brian, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for sticking around on Friday afternoon to hear what I think is a very important topic, and one that frankly is an essential component to building a climate that acknowledges and respects the importance of competition. As you may have heard previously today, but I'm forced to tell it to you anyway, my remarks are my views only and do not necessarily represent those of the U.S. Federal Trade Commission or any individual commissioner. I just wanted to start by offering really some practical thoughts on an antitrust compliance program from the standpoint of a U.S. enforcement agency. Maybe the first way to begin is with the sort of basic point that our goal as enforcers is essentially twofold. I mean, we want to do everything that we can to encourage compliance with competition laws. It should go without saying. And we're also ready to take action when firms don't comply. So there's sort of two sides to the coin, and we do some things to foster compliance with firms. But maybe the most important takeaway here is that from the U.S. standpoint, the firms private firms are really on their own. It's their responsibility to understand what the law is. And to comply with it. We don't require a certain format for a compliance program. We don't have really like a checklist of things that you have to do. It doesn't really work that way. It works best at least from my standpoint, from coming from the U.S. experience, because the firms themselves, the private firms themselves, know their business far better than we ever will. They know their employees far better than we can ever learn. They know the risks that they face a lot better than anybody, any government agency coming from the outside would be able to tell them. This is really sort of perfect area before I was at the FTC. When I was in private practice, we did an awful lot of compliance counseling. So it's really kind of the perfect area for firms to engage with either their lawyers internally or their lawyers outside to develop a really rigorous kind of compliance program. That being said, we do have, as an agency, we do have a very important role in sort of fostering a culture of compliance. And I'll talk about just a couple of ways in which we do that. We also, maybe the one very minor kind of exception, I don't even know if it's much of an exception, would have to do in the context of remedies. At times, often in merger remedies, there may be some ongoing compliance requirement that the government order may impose from the U.S. We may, if it's a conduct kind of case, on the civil side, we may have some sort of outside monitor that may be part of the resolution of that case. Those aren't really what I'm thinking about, and I don't think that's kind of the general take on what we're talking about in terms of compliance. Those are pretty special types of circumstances, but I thought I'd point them out. So this slide I had intended to sort of cast this as a slide that would have the carrot on one side and the stick on the other, but then when I actually sat down and wrote it, I realized there is no carrot and that the stick is really, really big. So that's not the right way to think of this. I think this slide, what I did on the left here is just a column that identifies all the ways in which we as an agency are sort of committed to transparency. And I think transparency from the agency side is sort of the critical component to informing the private sector what it is that we think constitutes acceptable behavior and what it is that we think constitutes a violation of competition laws. As you can see, there's kind of a laundry list here of all the different things that we do. This is basically everything I could think of as quickly as I could about what we do. We try to make everything as transparent as we can. That includes, not just published judicial decisions, which are, quite transparent and probably the core of what you want to think about when you want to figure out how to comply with the antitrust laws, but also in our case settlements, we issue public statements that are often quite detailed, explaining the competitive theory at stake, and some information about the structure and nature of the market and competition in the affected markets. Just a quick word on that. I think the value of transparency is always sort of at odds a little bit with the desire to keep information confidential, both sort of business sensitive kind of information that should be kept confidential, as well as sometimes agency processes are a little reluctant to give that up. But I think the emphasis, and we heard a lot about this yesterday, frankly, is the need to really promote transparency to the extent possible. And I think the more transparent you are as an agency, the more likely you'll be able to encourage compliance with the outside world. I'll just talk about a couple of other things. We do sometimes, if we have a major case that we've closed without action, the commission may issue a statement describing the reasons for that. That's a pretty good way of kind of understanding where we sit in terms of whatever law is at stake. And there was a recent set of mergers in the office superstore sector that actually kind of came out from a merger a few years ago that in which the commission issued an explanation of its decision not to enforce. And probably the other big one that we get are these that help on the transparency side. I won't go through the rest of them. Would be like the enforcement guidelines. And here I'm thinking about, like, on the merger side, it would be the horizontal merger guidelines. We have joint venture guidelines that talk about basically agreements between firms in the joint venture context, what's acceptable and what's not. And those, again, are really useful tools. I think the other half of this slide is sort of the deterrent effect, and it's the big stick. And enabled to have, and for the agency to have sort of the credible deterrent effect that does a lot to encourage compliance from the outside world, I think there's a few key points that the agency needs to have. The first being that the agency needs to be able to have the authority and the ability to detect misconduct when it occurs. We just heard the panel about the various legal mechanisms that agencies around the world have in place to collect evidence. And I think that's obviously a huge part of it, and we've heard for the past couple of days about the issues here with AMCU and the ability to collect the necessary evidence to uncover violations when they occur. I also think there's issues with having to do with the capacity to analyze the evidence. I think that's part of this as well. Bringing the case through courts, having the, again, to be a credible deterrent. I think you need to have the capacity and ability to do that. And finally, and this is the big one, it has to do with penalties for noncompliance. And in the U.S., of course, we have quite a bit, not just injunctive relief on the civil side. We have criminal fines and even prison on the cartel side and the criminal side that my colleagues at the Antitrust Division do from the Justice Department. But the relief, it's important to remember that in the U.S. system, the relief on the federal side is augmented by sometimes parallel actions that can be brought by the individual states. Each state has an attorney general and has the capability of bringing actions as well. And of course, maybe most important of all, we have a very significant private right of action that offers treble damages. So that creates hopefully some very meaningful deterrent effect that has the desired result, one would hope, of encouraging compliance. Of encouraging compliance. So the next slide here is just basically an outline of the elements that you might look for in an effective compliance program, if that's what you were trying to design. Again, this comes really more from sort of accepted conventional wisdom of how these things should go, and a little bit of personal experience back when from my time in the private firm. It's I think pretty standard, but I think it's important to kind of walk through. And I'll try to do it pretty quickly. But the first point to make is that any sort of program needs to have very clearly established standards. Usually there's always a written policy involved. The most common way that I've seen this done is to identify, sort of have red light, yellow light, green light, where you identify conduct that's absolutely prohibited, conduct that is, that is going to be okay, and then you have a yellow light that is conduct that requires somebody that knows something about how the antitrust laws work to figure out whether you're going to be in trouble. You want to draft something like this in plain English because you're going to be speaking, of course, to non-experts. And I think it's very important to emphasize the consequences, I was just mentioning, to emphasize the consequences of wrongdoing. I think everybody would agree that just having a document with a set of compliance standards is inadequate to establishing the right kind of compliance culture that you want. You need to augment that with compliance training. And here, this is, there's a million ways you can do this. It can be in-person training by knowledgeable counsel. You want to try to make it as practical as can be. You'd like to try to have some either case examples or some examples actually rooted in the actual business that you're dealing with that can help kind of make these sort of lessons hit home. The other thing you probably want to think about is whether it makes sense to target additional training or specific training for employees who might be in sensitive positions. And here I'm thinking of, say, if you had employees that were involved in trade association activities, for instance. Those are sort of the likely targets for some additional compliance training. Just very quickly, I would say that a decent compliance program ought to be part of a broader set of compliance programs. And so competition is just sort of one area that firms ought to think about. It's, you know, there's issues with tax compliance, with securities, with employment issues. All of this should be sort of at the same level as what the competition issues should be at the same level as those other types of compliance programs. Encouraging management support, having senior managers visibly in support of and participating in the compliance program, I think, is absolutely essential. They must sort of lead by example here. And in fact, most of these tips are frankly just sort of good management sort of tips. Usually what I've seen and what I think works better than not is having some senior manager assigned as basically the compliance officer in charge of running the programs and being the sort of antitrust compliance face on this whole effort. I mentioned this a little bit before, but tailoring the program to meet the risks faced by the company, again, I think that's an important way to make these things effective and most useful. And here, you know, you can tailor these in a lot of different ways, but again, you want to focus on the key risks that the business face and the key employees that are encountering those risks most frequently. The last few points I'll just make very quickly. Any sort of program is really only going to work if you have a mechanism for monitoring compliance, if you have some sense of either some sense of an audit maybe, or some sort of surprise audit where you look at people's documents, or you have some kind of test to make sure that the lessons are being followed up on. A reporting mechanism, I think, is also critical, so that violations, when identified internally, can be reported on confidentially and without fear of repercussion. And finally, within the company, there needs to be some mechanism for punishing non-compliance, which can ultimately perhaps lead to termination as well. So those are just some, I think, pretty standard kinds of elements that I've seen in dealing with this stuff in the past. I think, you know, there's obviously a lot more to it, but the point about making these a very active, sort of an actively managed part of the corporate culture within the firm, I think is really critical to creating the kind of climate that respects the competition laws, and ultimately that's a key point in making this whole effort successful. So with that, I'll thank you all for your attention, and I'll pass the mic over.
Brian, thank you very much. We'll probably have questions, at least I have one after. I suggest we end with the presentation of the other speakers. Я перепрошую, давайте ми адресуватимемо питання.
До кінця цієї сесії, а потім поставимо запитання. I understand that there'll be people who would like to ask questions, and so far as compliance programs are in place not only in Henkel, Renato Fernando from Italy will speak next.
Thank you, Oksana. Dobro dnia. Okay, that was all my Ukrainian. Buongiorno, everybody. I hope you are fine. Personally, I'm exhausted. They have been 2 very dense and thought-provoking days. Personally, I got a lot of inputs from the discussions, so I can't wait to go back to Italy and discuss with my colleagues about some new ideas that I received. Therefore, I would like to thank Chairman Terentiev and all the organizers of this event, which is not important only for Ukraine, but from any competition practitioner who is interested in compare and find new views on his work, on her work. Okay, since I work on international affairs for the Italian Competition Authority, what I'd like to do is to share with you some takeouts from the international discussion about compliance, which is a very topical issue these days. And then I will I will tell you the Italian side of the story. You know, we Italians tend to be quite creative, so maybe I have a story that might be of some interest for you. You see this figure, I stole it from a report by the British Office of Trading, which is now named Competition and Markets Authority after its reform. And there is a sort of, I would call it competition architecture. It's similar to a Greek temple. You see the core, the kernel, is competition compliance. And yesterday, Frédéric Geny was very effective in explaining why everyone is better off if businesses abide by the rules, by competition rules. And competition compliance is sheltered by a nice roof, which is deterrence. And these two elements are supported by three pillars: knowledge of competition rules, sanctions and enforcement, and voluntary compliance measures. Now I'm going to go through these three pillars very briefly, while focusing on the third pillar because it is the heart of today's discussion. First of all, knowledge, first pillar. This is also a stolen figure from, I think, from an FTC presentation. Thanks, FTC. About knowledge. Okay. As you can see, increased understanding of what's illegal leads to more competitive markets. Why? On the one hand, because businesses comply, and that is beneficial for competitive markets. On the other hand, because businesses report infringements. This leads to enforcement, which in turn leads to more competitive markets. Now, what is the degree of competition rules at an international level? I was saying that I work on international affairs, and actually most of my job is on the activity of the International Competition Network, which is a network which gathers 132 jurisdictions throughout the world. And its work is organized by working groups. And there is a working group called Advocacy Working Group that the Italian Competition Authority has the honor to co-chair together with the Swedish Competition Authority and the Mexican Competition Authority. And what we did 2 years ago was this competition culture project. So we conducted a survey to understand the degree of knowledge of competition rules in the world by different stakeholders. And the results are quite striking. This is the histogram about the competition awareness among businesses. You see the blue bars refer to large businesses, while the red bars are small and medium enterprises. And of course, zero means zero knowledge of competition rules. 10 is perfect knowledge. You can see that large businesses concentrate on 6, 7, and 8 marks, which means, and even 9. That's good news. Large businesses normally have a good understanding of competition rules. But the bad news is about small companies. As you can see, their marks are between 3, 4, 5, and then there is a sudden decrease. So here we have a problem. Small companies do not have a clue about competition principles. And actually, there are a lot of positive messages that a competition agency can deliver to companies to convince them that competition is beneficial for them too. It's not just a matter of stick. What can they say? They can say that sound competition promotes level playing field and increased innovation and efficiency. And we all know that all industry need to be innovative and to be efficient. Sound competition protects businesses from artificial barriers to entry, creating opportunities to enter markets and grow. And this is particularly interesting for smaller and more efficient businesses. And competition helps companies to compete at the international level because it improves resource allocation and efficiency. And finally, businesses have the opportunity to inform competition policy and support competition law enforcement. Businesses are not only victims of competition enforcement, they can really play a role as protagonists, and I will come back to that. Where did I take these messages from? From another project that we carried out last year as the Advocacy Working Group, which is titled Explaining the Benefits of Competition to Businesses. Now, what are competition agencies doing to promote competition culture? I personally made this figure this time. This is mine. While performing the project Explaining the Benefits of Competition to Businesses, we collected a lot of case studies from different jurisdictions. And what we observed is that competition agencies are extremely active in promoting competition awareness. There is a wide range of activities from simple guidance to businesses, to booklets and brochure to explain what competition is about, or video, or even the use of social network. And also in terms of interaction may vary substantially from a simple message delivery to a request for feedback and even a reach out. There are competition agencies that organized road shows across the country to explain, to meet business associations and explain and interact and discuss with businesses. That was the end of the first pillar. Let's go to the second pillar, sanctions and enforcement. Now, why are sanctions and enforcement so important for competition compliance? Because it's a matter of incentives. Again, Frédéric Cheny yesterday said that public policy objectives and private incentives should be aligned, otherwise you will never get competitive markets. Now, what sanctions do is they increase the cost for business in case of non-compliance, of infringement. At the same time, enforcement, the credible enforcement, increases the probability that non-compliant behavior is detected and penalized. Why is this important? Because you have deterrence if risk is higher than opportunity. So for companies, opportunity is the expected extra profit from the violation, whereas the risk is the cost of non-compliance, which means the sanction, multiplied by the probability to be detected. And I put a very simple example. Imagine you expect to get 20,000 euro from participation in a cartel. That's what you expect to get as an extra profit coming from the increase, the concerted increase of the price. But if you expect a sanction of 100,000 in case your company is detected, and you think that the agency is very active, and there is a 1/4 of probability, 25%, that you can get caught, then your expected risk, your expected cost of participation in the cartel would be 25,000 euros, which is higher than 20. And so your economic incentives, I'm not speaking about ethical aspects, which of course play a role. I'm not considering jurisdictions where participation in a cartel is a criminal offense, but from the administrative side, from an economic perspective, this is how the reasoning of the companies. the good news is that I'm already at the third pillar, so I'm towards the end of my presentation. The bad news is that I will devote a bit more of time on this issue. I stole another a comic, and it says, "It's just the new compliance officer. Administration wanted him to have more visibility with the staff." Just to say that some companies take competition compliance very seriously. And should agencies be interested in companies adopting compliance programs? Of course, because compliance programs help competition. How? First of all, they create a competition culture, and therefore they increase legal certainty for undertaking, who can better assess both internal behaviors and the activity of their competitors. And therefore, you can strengthen the first pillar. You remember it was knowledge. And at the same time, they increase the cases of infringement spontaneously reported by undertakings, like, for instance, participation in leniency applications. Now, it's in the interest of competition agencies to encourage companies to adopt compliance programs, but how far should competition agencies go? And there is not an international consensus about the best way to encourage companies, and I think it depends on different national features, the different features of the national economy that the competition agencies face. So some competition agencies provide guidance on how to design an effective compliance program. Some other even assess compliance programs that are submitted to the competition agencies. I already say that the Italian Competition Authority opted for the third option because we believe, as also Brian was saying, that the design of the compliance program should be in the discretion of the company. The company knows its industry, knows its employees, and knows how best to approach the compliance issue. What we did, we went for the carrot. We decided to introduce a recognition of a compliance program as a mitigating factor for fines. Actually, in 2014, we published guidelines on the calculation of fines, and one of the provisions introduced the possibility for a reduction up to 15% of the fine in case of adoption and observance of a specific compliance program in line with the European and international best practices. As you can see, it was quite a courageous move. And I will draw some first takeouts from our experience in these 2 years. And it was not a light-hearted decision. It was taken in light of the specific characteristics of the Italian economy. Consider that in Italy, 95% of the companies are micro enterprises. They have 9 or less employees, whereas the big companies, which have more than 250 employees, are 0.15% of the total. And if you remember the figures that I showed previously, that means that we can expect the competition culture in Italy is very low, because in small companies, the level of awareness is low. And 47 of Italian employees actually work in micro enterprises, which is quite different from the European average, which is 29%. Okay, and the decision was taken after an internal and an external discussion. Internal because we decided we wanted to enrich our toolbox of competition policy, which already includes fines, leniency, private enforcement, competition advocacy, and social disapproval. But we also conducted a public consultation. Do you remember when I said businesses should feel that they can be protagonists of competition enforcement? This was a case. They had the opportunity to express their views about the possible introduction of this reduction, and of course they were in great favor of this provision. And we are not completely naive. We were aware of the possible downsides of such a decision, because the main issue is how to distinguish a real from a cosmetic compliance program. You understand that as soon as a party to the proceedings understands that it can get a 15 reduction of the possible fines, then it has an immediate incentive to adopt a fake compliance program. So the issue now at that point is for the competition authority to distinguish what is real from what is fake. And in the guidelines themselves, we specify that the parties should prove actual and concrete commitment to respect what envisaged in the program. And we listed several conditions that must be fulfilled. I will not go into them because more or less they reflect what Brian was mentioning about effective compliance programs. Now, I'm approaching the end of my presentation. I would like to share with you the first results of the Italian experience. Consider that the guidelines were adopted in October 2014. They came into force in early 2015, so we have 2 years of experience. What are the first results? I would say they are promising results. 32 companies adopted new compliance programs. What is important is most of them were adopted by small, medium enterprises and in markets typically prone to endemic collusion. For example, 14 cases of adoption are in the cement, concrete sector. These kind of companies are very usual clients of the Italian Competition Authority for cartels. And what is quite remarkable is in one case the trade association included the adoption of compliance programs as a prerequisite to join the association, to become a member. So if you want to apply for the business association, you first have to adopt a compliance program, which is very powerful. I think it was in the fashion model industry. Very Italian. Okay. And the last 2 slides. Another very positive sign is that quite recently, in April 2016, the main Italian Association of Businesses, Confindustria, which is the association of the business associations in Italy, adopted compliance guidelines. And they included a lot of indications on how to draft and put in place an effective compliance programs, including a lot of actual cases that we carried out, so that companies can really understand how the Italian Competition Authority works. And these guidelines were disseminated among members. So in the end, I asked myself the question, how far competition agencies should go to encourage companies to adopt compliance programs? Am I recommended that you introduce a reduction on the fines? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I can witness is that in the Italian economy, that measure seems to be working. But my reply would be there is no one size fits all. Each competition authority should analyze the specific features of its economy, of its companies, and decide what is the most effective path to go through. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. Colorful presentation. I'm hopeful it sent vibes into the audience. Наш наступний.
Уважно її вислухати. Our next speaker is Mr. Zavada. Alexander Zavada heads the public council under our committee. He was himself head of the Anti-Monopoly Committee of Ukraine. Mr. Zavada, what do you have to say with regard to both internal and external factors that might promote compliance?
Thank you. The subject matter that we're discussing now, as I can see, is actually probably the best, the tastiest part of this cake. So as we could see from wonderful presentations of our colleagues from other countries, compliance and existence of compliance and spread of such programs depends significantly on certain preconditions created by the state. I mean the effective legislation, effective implementation of such legislation. So, So evidently we need to go through this whole path. Consequently, and then we'll probably achieve this same level of effective cooperation between the government and the businesses through compliance programs, since the Ukrainian public mostly is aware of the public council with the AMC, but maybe our foreign colleagues are not aware of our activities. So I'll tell you briefly that our public council for the Anti-Monopoly Committee was re-elected. We actually go for elections every 2 years, and now our members are 40 civil society organizations, normally called NGOs. Most of them are business communities, of general nature, like American Chamber of Commerce or sectoral organizations. I represent the Ukrainian Federation of Insurers. So actually this public council goal is to ensure public consultations between with the Anti-Monopoly Committee, and also that's a path for the business communities, for the public to communicate with AMC. That this is two-way street. The public can receive from the AMC the freshest information on any ideas which are being worked on by the committee. I'm talking certainly about the public side. Of course, it's about what they do concerning the legislation. And also the public can bring to the notice of the AMC any problems arising in certain sectors. So I think when we talk about the support of compliance programs and keeping in mind that specific knowledge is required for that, so the actually the training, education in this knowledge is the first step. And of course, AMC has a wide circle of methods of communications, like working groups, round tables, the fora like that, and in particular they have their website, which also offers a lot of information which is useful for businesses to make sure that the businesses have the right understanding of the very nature of competition legislation and respective practices. still here in Ukraine, we understand and we can clearly see that the problems related to inspections, audits, and also including the legislation which is now putting some restrictions on the committee's powers, investigative powers. And I remember our first draft law proposed by the Commission when we wrote this draft law about the searches, seizures, and potential related powers for the Anti-Monopoly Committee, but the current legislation instead just made it more complicated to implement such activities and to such investigative actions, and the members of our public council certainly for the efficiency of the committee, which certainly includes the necessary powers. Clearly, the need to have a compliance program will be perceived better and better. We can feel it within our public council, because as soon as the AMC finishes any successful investigation and wins any cases in the court, the business association immediately realizes that this fact needs special attention, and the business association then becomes very actively involved in activities of our public council. So it's kind of a message, for the sector, preventing the sector from repeating similar violations, and at the same time they suddenly become more interested in making sure they will not have similar problems in the future. I have some wishes, actually, of the practical nature and also proposals. Our committee has been publishing the cases on violations on its site, including the decisions permitting certain activities. So what's important here? To use it properly, we certainly need to summarize the current practices periodically, to generalize them. And I think that the members of our council, using the information from open sources about decisions of the Anti-Monopoly Committee, initiated the voluntary efforts to disseminate this information, to make the people aware, the public aware of the practices of AMC, and now this information is available to anybody. I think now it's very important to make this kind of generalization or summaries of AMC decisions with regard to public procurement. So not only the resources of the committee need to be expanded and increased, it's also important to remove the causes of such reasons, of such violations. For instance, I think a lot of educational efforts is needed to educate actually the ministries and the officials about the legislation and about the cases initiated by AMC with this respect. Of course, I've talked now about the public authorities. Of course, for businesses, compliance programs cannot be imposed by the government. The government can just create certain incentives for the businesses to have such programs, so it's a voluntary thing. While for the public authorities, which are under control of Anti-Monopoly Committee, probably need to consider kind of a pilot document, typical document, which could be then introduced at the level of the line ministries to prevent further violations. And then this document will trickle down to the sector enterprises and further on. Also, I'd like to say a few words about about this idea of taking the existence of such compliance programs in account for the purposes of sanctions. Several years ago, actually, this discussion started. I'm rather supportive to the idea of the European Union, where they are rather inclined if there is a serious violation, then the compliance program is rather evidence of the purposeful violation, because if you are aware that you are violating something, you still do, then that's intentional violation. On the other hand, there are cases when compliance program does not coincide with business. Well, okay, let me give you an example. I work in the insurance business, where the competition is probably stiffer than is really required, although you never have too much competition. But in our case, we have national, domestic businesses, smaller, bigger companies, international insurers, etc. So, of course, it offers many opportunities to abuse. It never offers opportunities to abuse dominating position or to organize a cartel. So it looks like nobody intends to really violate the rules, and I am personally responsible for this anti-monopoly compliance. It's just my role, which has become traditional. But still, we have situations which just go beyond my control. For instance, when one of territorial branches of our company placed advertising offering all kinds of insurance. Of course, the company does not have all kinds of licenses, and we had to pay the fine for misleading information, although that was not the company's decision. That was decision of one of regional managers, discretional decision. But that's the confirmation of the fact that you can apply all kinds of efforts to hold everything under control. You still need a good system in place which would prevent anybody from violating the rules. Second, I am the president of the Council for Nuclear Insurance Pool, and we have permission for 3 years to have coordinated actions with respect to our regulation on the membership. And the directorate of this pool was supposed to remember on time that this permission would lose its validity in half a year. So they just forgot to renew it. And actually, again, penalties were applied. Once again, one leader cannot keep everything in mind, cannot remember everything. That's why I think we need the well-established system which would prevent any violations of this kind just because of an oversight. Well, of course, if you are dealing with minor businesses and your business is not expected to even be able to get into big violations, then maybe this problem is not that important. But still, I believe for any business it's relevant to have such programs. So our intention, number one, is to still insist on vesting the AMC with proper powers and However surprising it is, the law on state aid will help us with the change in the powers of the AMC. Because in order to control these issues of state aid, the AMC will certainly need more resources, and in order to be able to operate these resources, of course, it will need more powers. So maybe from this point of view, the compliance programs need special attention. I can also promise that I will initiate the discussion at my council at their meeting this matter of compliance program, because we have wonderful materials prepared, especially prepared by our esteemed foreign experts, and I would appreciate if these materials become available to all our business communities. They will be really helpful. Okay, thank you for your presentation and your suggestion to use your public council as a platform. We'll be waiting for the materials. Our next speaker, and I still want you to watch the time, we just have 15 minutes to go. This is Olga Lukyanova, who represents the real business. She is the head of the legal department of Henkel Ukraine. So, Olga, please, the floor is yours. Good evening. I'm sorry for being the last speaker. I'll try to wake you up, and I'll try to support this idea of compliance, because I can say it's kind of fading. I'd like to give you the real example of the working and effective system which really protects your business from losses. Our colleague, a representative of the United States, told us the whole theory. I mean, I was sitting here and I thought it was just my presentation. The colleague just told the theory, and I'll give you some examples how it can help in your work. So this system was introduced in 2008 in our company. Of course, that was because of the lesson learned. We had to pay a huge penalty. That was a cartel. That was cartel with participation of our competitors. We were punished also in the US and in Germany. It really took a long time to recover. And then it was decided that the corporation will introduce this compliance management system. So this system is the basic or the basis for actually all global businesses, helping us achieving our objectives and to sell our products in the right way, keeping the good reputation for our consumers. The colleagues from Italy and US has already mentioned that this program is based on 3 key points. This is prevention, uncovering, and response. So first, the most important is about prevention, because detection or uncovering and response is for lawyers. They do something. Well, when you have consequences, you need to do something about that. But all major corporation has a code of conduct, which I would call a Bible of the corporation, where the company makes its major key statements. And as Brian said, the company states there about their zero tolerance points, what the company will never accept. So major statement on concerning anti-monopoly legislation is very simple. We will not tolerate any violations of anti-monopoly legislation, and any employees in breach of this legislation will be punished severely because it's almost about the reputation of the company. Just remember the case of BP Corporation, who had a spill of oil in the ocean, and it took them several years to try to recover their image. So they lost billions and billions. And the recent scandal with Volkswagen with the diesel engines, you remember, it still causes a lot of losses to them, and more importantly, the image of first-class car was practically lost. Although that's really great car to drive. Well, we are looking at three major directions of compliance risk. This is fight against corruption, conflict of interest, unlawful business deals. We look at the prevention of fraud, including money laundering, safety, security of the data, and tax evasions. And of course, the third direction as a cornerstone of compliance program is the competition. This is so-called leadership. And my American colleagues has mentioned that, meaning the decisions made by top management of the company, which may entail very serious consequences. And of course, compliance with the anti-monopoly legislation. Certainly, as I said already, the main direction of the compliance system is anti-monopoly or competition compliance. What was our start? Overnight, it was decided that the compliance will be controlled by the lawyers, because they know very well the anti-monopoly legislation. They can look at different jurisdictions, and they will try to explain to our top managers, our salespersons, our agents about the right way to do their job, including their behavior on the market, to make our business transparent, honest, and consequently successful. The main three statements with regard to antitrust compliance program is zero tolerance to deals or agreements with the competitors, imposition of any conditions on the clients and suppliers, vertical relations, and abuse of dominating situation on the market. These are three areas where our compliance officers pay attention to. We explain to all of our employees what they are supposed to do, what kind of actions they can undertake when they have a meeting or when they execute a contract, etc. We have the following system to monitor behavior of our employees. First, we have the program of internal and external audits, which are conducted on a regular basis and in different areas. And also, several times we had the notion of down rates, which exists in a number of countries. We have a program which we call down rate simulation, that may be antitrust, down rate mobbing, down rate just when we check not only knowledge of the people, we also check their ability to behave properly in the circumstances which can bring some risks to the company. The people need to understand their area of responsibility, and they must be disciplined with this respect, because all of them are part of a big company. They represent its name. We monitor internal and external correspondence, all official letters, all kinds of correspondence. I am not trying to... Well, there are some corporations which would read the correspondence of some employees and have special personnel for that. Unfortunately, we certainly do not monitor the internal correspondence between the employees, but we do monitor all correspondence, external correspondence, incoming and outgoing of the company to detect such risks. Also, we monitor all our membership in any association, and when our employee goes somewhere where our competitors are going to be, we ask for special permission from compliance officer from our headquarters in Düsseldorf, and there is a history which is recorded, and if tomorrow somebody tells that our employee did something during a meeting, we can immediately check whether this employee was allowed to go there and what he or she was supposed to do. By the way, we minimized to the maximum extent possible any participation in any association, unless there is a clear need of our participation, because in Europe associations are very popular, just to have a cup of tea and to talk about the prices at the market. That's not always useful. Some associations are just idle or exist in vain. We actually conduct meetings with our suppliers once or twice a year, and they're informative enough. So probably the most interesting part that I'd like to share is the life of work. Brian also mentioned that in addition to the statements. We have a number of policies and standards developed and conducted at the global level. Many of them are adopted also here in Ukraine. I don't like this differentiation between international and Ukrainian legislation. We always try to comply with the international level requirements, because sooner or later we'll be there. So sooner or later we will have to comply with those requirements. It's already now when we are introducing European and American requirements, because we're the global corporation working all around the world. In addition to the code of conduct, we have the so-called antitrust compliance policy, which actually deals with our basic principles, where we are tolerant, and where we talk about leniency program. We have the program of compliance regulating execution of the contracts, the procedure to review and to approve drafts of the contracts. We have authorization policy. We have very clear control over the powers of different levels of management. And who is allowed to dispose of the funds of the company. Actually, any contract related to any disbursement of money, for instance, has to be approved by at least two companies' manager, plus it has to be signed off by the legal department. We also monitor very attentively donations, membership, sponsorship, because in many cases these are good grounds for fraud or corruption. It's clearly described in our rules. Our people know how they can spend money and how they should report for it. We have regular trainings for all employees. Twice a year I conduct trainings. I conduct we have 4 businesses where I tell them about anti-monopoly legislations, about any notions related to antitrust concept, compliance concept. I explain what's the right way to behave when meeting a competitor. We have quite well established compliance culture within the company. It's taken very seriously, and actually at any meeting there is a compliance officer, and we often receive many questions, and the people are aware that this compliance is a must, which in addition will allow them avoiding very serious problems. We also have workshops, seminars for the compliance officers conducted for even presidents, directors, where they're informed about any changes in approaches, international legislation. We have unique experience in Ukraine. We developed video training course for the employees. We know that sometimes compliance seems to be a boring topic, so we found some interesting cartoons in UK about antitrust authority, where they explain in a very plain language what kind of violations can take place. We actually record that them in Ukrainian, and indeed the headquarters were really impressed with that. After that, France actually made their own videos, and now Russians are doing the same. That's very interesting experience. You know, people like visualization, and certainly the people like a more direct participation. It's like a viral advertising, if I can say so. The people actually they just repeat after the characters, yes, if there is a violation we need to report immediately, etc., etc. Of course we have individual consulting. Any employee can ask for a meeting with me to have a consultation, and they may misunderstand or be confused with some provisions of our policy. They can always count on my support. Our system also provides for two trainings, which then are finalized with the test, and the people receive the certificates confirming their participation in the training course. And of course, actually the materials of these trainings are also distributed for those who, because of some reasons, could not participate, and then they're still subject to the test. We've introduced the system hotline 24/7 for the top management and also on the global level. If all of a sudden the regulator comes to see us with a down rate, having respective powers, we can immediately consult. Our top managers can immediately receive the legal aid, because I certainly cannot stay 24/7 online, and that certainly ensures uninterrupted work and make sure that we are within the legal field.
There are external consultants who do training on anti-competition legislation updates. Our key message is comply to avoid problems, and it works. Matter of fact, at least the number of compliance cases has recently decreased. There's knowledge, people use this knowledge, they are aware of the rules of correspondence or interpersonal relations, they know that misconduct will entail measures, so be alerted. Thank you, that's all. Thank you, Olha. Are you with me? I see that there are some smiles and bright eyes. We have one other speaker. It's the end of the work week. Bogdanova Elizaveta is deputy head of Naftogaz legal department. So she'll probably tell us about compliance mechanisms that exist in Naftogaz. Thank you. I can only hope that you are still alert, awake. Let me start by saying that if this conference had taken place back in 24, a representative of our company would have probably started by saying how good it is to have compliance, but this public sector is over-regulated, very different from private sector, and we have to wait for quite some time before it is a reality in the public sector. But it's 2017, and I am happy to tell you that Naftogaz, within the framework of public sector reform, is also undergoing retuning, so to speak, of different processes, personnel, etc., in order to help the public sector to catch up with the reforms elsewhere. Speaking of the values that are posted publicly, you can see for yourself. Anti-competition behavior is unquestionably outside of those values. They run contrary to those values. Naftogaz would like to drive reforms in the gas sector. It means that Naftogaz is and has historically been interested in the development of a free market. Being so passionate about that, we expect that our partners will also be espousing the principles of competition and keen to comply. Now, we heard a very interesting argument in favor of compliance, which is built from within by the certain bureaucratic procedures. In the public enterprises, state-owned enterprises, this is already in place. Almost every step is regulated. You can't make a movement unless it's somehow regulated by an internal document, by piece of regulation. It's like cross-fertilization, and the private sector may benefit by that as well. Now, let me tell you where we are. We are a natural gas supply, and we supply to the regulated sector and unregulated sector. I mean, we supply to heat generating companies, that is to say, your homes are warm because of our supplies. We also sell gas. We're in natural gas trade. And typically we sell direct or via traders. We also are in the market of natural gas procurements. So that's we're talking about external market procurements. And the fourth market, as officially defined by the Intermonai Monopoly Committee, is the natural gas transit. We do that on the basis of Gazprom agreements dating back to erstwhile time. Now, there is no policy or competition policy as a written document in Naftogaz, and I would be surprised to learn that there are many companies in Ukraine that do, but the system of internal controls which is in place in Naftogaz also deals with competition. The document we have was approved by the government, and it lists measures to be implemented under the supervision of under the oversight of the Naftogaz supervisory board. There are 7 independent members of the board, 3 of whom are foreigners. We have a risk manager, we have a compliance officer, and the compliance officer is independent of the legal division where I work. This probably stems from the fact that first we have to build that compliance structure within the company, and then think about an interface with the legal department. Plus, every document is subject to counter-signature. In other words, you cannot submit a document to the supervisors unless this document has been coordinated or countersigned by other managers. Well, it is quite bureaucratic, but not always bureaucracy is bad. I took note of many ideas. I'm gonna take many of them home and will certainly use them in order to improve our governance with those specific measures, and I hope that we'll soon be able to report of the effects of such exercise. Now, should there be a separate document, or rather a compliance policy? Well, it's legal, but it has probably have more to do. It has more to do with probably risk management. So, a separate document should be fit for use. I have some rule drafting experience, so I have certain doubts as to whether we'd be able to produce an all-embracing document, a holistic document, take incitement, harassment. Psychologically, we understand what they mean, but I am not sure that we can all of those commit to paper. So if we see the documents do not work, we start improving them, and it goes on and on and on. So I'd say that it would be better that competition policy be made part of the compliance system. And of course we have to work in an open market, because open market benefits all. So that's the future. Thank you, Elizaveta. We'll be watching you. You were one of the first to initiate a reform of corporate governance, so it would be really interesting to see how you will implement it in practice. I have a number of questions to ask myself, but I will probably not do that right now. Let me ask you, Yuri, is the Anti-Monopoly Committee gonna incentivize Ukrainian businesses for the development of such programs? On May 19, 2015, right after the compliance session at the Legal Practice Forum, an announcement was made of you having been appointed in the office. So, thank you. When I was in Metro Group or Solol Kryvyi Rih, I indeed had I was responsible for compliance, so I'm not a stranger to this discussion and all those challenges that are there are those that I had to deal with myself. It was part of my job description. Now, is a compliance program a burden or a benefit? Well, hard to say. It's not so binary. There are specific circumstances, and in some circumstances, depending on who is the offender, what was this availability of compliance program can be a mitigating circumstance or an aggravating one, if I understand you were aware of the offense and committed it intentionally. So I can say that I remember when we were doing our fines manual, we decided to say nothing about compliance, instead providing an exhaustive list of mitigating circumstances. Now, how do we encourage compliance programs? Of course, we are univocally interested in raising the awareness of competition policy, of the thin dividing line, and also since the legal order in many respects, take competition law, it's laws are very similar, but enforcement and jurisprudence may vary from country to country. Therefore, value-based corporate compliance programs should also be, in some respects, similar, but at the same time we should stick to the think globally, act locally principles, that is to say, being attentive to the specifics of Ukraine. Indeed, May 19, 2015, I said that communication would be one of the priorities for the committee, including compliance programs that we too have to kind of standardize, in the good sense of the word, our communication at the level of territorial divisions when we do field work, not in this nice hotel with people who know of OECD compliance, but somewhere in the middle of nowhere where they have their own challenges with drinking cases or tender distortion or unfair competition or anti-competitive behavior of public authorities. You have to be able to translate those nice international terms into the language comprehensible to ordinary peoples.
So I think that what practical conclusions can we make from that? If we lay this bridge from the last session to the concluding remarks, of course, everything that we discussed here can be implemented in practice, but I remember yet when with Metro Group I had a lot of trainings, and they would say that any human being is capable of running a marathon. Whoever, it's not a problem to run 42 kilometers. It's a matter of your speed and time. Meaning that it's difficult to make it in 2 hours, but probably it's easy to make it in 24 hours. So the question is, what resources, what is our way to comply with these recommendations? And we can only do that together, because whatever is my desire to write the new legislation, write new procedures, or maybe to regulate independence of my body, of my authority, and yeah, you can really do it like in 3 or 4 days, draft the law, but probably the result will not be the one that we really want. So probably just when we are in this bilateral practical dialogue, practical I would say when interaction with all of you, we can really move forward and achieve some results. I would start with a very practical issue. For instance, like compliance programs. For instance, you see, for me, this matter of compliance program was one of my initiatives in the private company, but I couldn't do it alone. And nor can I do it as chair of the committee. So maybe there are some volunteers representing legal community, business community, who would like to maybe finalize draft document, because it's actually 70% ready. I would appreciate if we could really do it within some reasonable time, because the matter is about focusing and executing. So I personally, well, how can we do that? If indeed we can use any platform like Civic or this public council platform, or there may be personal initiative. If any one of you would like to join any working group as an individual or as a company, please, you know my contact, this is my phone number. please write me, call me, and I'll be happy to accept any assistance that you can offer. I mean, very concrete assistance, of course, concrete actions, concrete work. Any other questions, or are we moving to the concluding remarks? Are there any questions from the floor? Yes. I'm Sergei Sherbin. I used to teach competition policy with the Academy of Public Administration. We learned a lot about competition laws, and we also trained our trainees to understand the concentration indexes. And from these presentations, now I understand that the concentrations at most of our markets is not reducing, it's increasing, which means that most of our markets are under control of the oligarchs and tend to be further monopolized and respectively abused by dominating companies. It's a global problem, and problem is not only the problem of Ukraine. What needs to be done in order to really prevent the situation when several companies at any market would dictate everything, in spite of all these compliances and other beautiful words? Thank you very much. This is a rhetoric question. Whose fault it is, and what should we do about that? Probably that's an issue for a separate forum. That may be the topic for this seventh forum, I believe. Well, I still recognize your question. To answer it in detail, it will take probably 30 minutes at least. I think that the concentration processes are taking place continuously all around the world. The concentration processes sometimes may witness the existence of the competition instead of absence of consultations. Our American colleagues said that actually when you analyze a concentration, you need to think whether the competition is protected or vice versa. There is, I would say, scientific abstract competition, but we deal with the practical competition. This is what's going on in Ukraine. We indeed can see a lot of oligopolized, I mean controlled by oligarchs market, where there is a very vague boundary between the monopolization and conspiracy or bid rigging or whatever. Sometimes you don't even need to negotiate, it's all clear. So we as Anti-Monopoly Committee, well, imagine you have two companies at the market. We certainly are interested in attracting more companies to this market. That's a question of barriers, and you can have different barriers. In Ukraine, most of the barriers are merely administrative. And if you look at the activities of the Anti-Monopoly Committee in 2014-15, significant portion of our work was devoted to these administrative barriers. This is confirmed by the surveys that we conducted at the energy markets. If you look at our activities at air transportation markets, well, you know, we have very famous air carrier, and one would ask me, how come you're not fighting this monopolist? And I say I would not fight consequences, I would fight the causes, the reasons for that. So when we work on air transportation markets, we used to organize some roundtables, which is not a panacea, of course, but we conducted in-depth analysis of the whole chain, from the air fuel ticketing process and up to final cost of an air ticket. And our main activities were oriented towards state aviation service, which actually develops the specific routes for air carriers. So we do something about barriers. We do systemic effort to identify the real status of the competition at the real markets. When I joined the Anti-Monopoly Committee, I was asked, what is the situation at the market of eggs, or say poultry? And the answer would be that the committee can operate only within the specific case or within specific proceedings. So at the moment when I joined the committee, maybe Mr. Shashun will actually oppose me, but actually that was what I heard in most of the cases, okay, from the specialists of the Anti-Monopoly Committee, that we are not supposed to monitor that unless we have a clear case. Now my personal approach is based on a different situation. We need to understand the real situation and the real markets. So that's why our organizational structure is now oriented towards having a concrete department dealing with the specific markets, having continuous picture of the situation at the market with regard to main players or main trends. Maybe you'll blame me of inefficiency because we are just doing the same that some ministries are doing. But here I will say that we just do not have the effective system of exchange of information between among public authorities, and that's why we need to actually do the same that probably is done by somebody else. Well, you see, I work in agrarian sector of economy, and well, the trends are not European. We have agro holdings owning more than 1 million hectares. And you know, there are many hostile takeovers, and you know, this market used to be the least monopolized. You're talking about oligopolization. Probably it's too early to talk about oligarch participation in those markets. If you look at the main concentrations, if we talk about Ukrainian, not international companies, yes, the trend is towards the agriculture-related markets. Indeed, this markets are very active now, but what I want to say that my objective as the head of the agency is to build a system rather than capturing smaller violations. To build the system means that we need to have continuous processes uncovering the problems and the market prioritizing those problems and making it possible for our public authorities to react in the proper way. It's a tough work, you know, we are very limited in our resources, but I can already tell you that we've made significant progress in developing our understanding and vision of the market and keeping continuous statistics with regard to specific markets. I think within 2 weeks you'll see our report for 2016, and you'll realize that we've had quite good effects of the systemic approach. There is the other side of this advocacy efforts, because if you move rather to advocacy than to other businesses, you may get too much statistics, and you will be asked a lot of questions about how many cases you initiated. But what's happening, we now have to repair an airplane while flying. So there are probably parliament members and other important officials who might not understand in full the need to get the systemic approach, and then after 2 years of the systemic work we'll have much better picture and much better opportunities. I remember at a conference we analyzed our colleagues from Mexico. For instance, their competition agency engaged in problems with telecom sector when it became really strong, and it took them 7 years to really get the strength. So here, as I can see, the head does not trust the translators. We're sorry. But, well, let me finish probably this now. So what I'm trying to say, we need a system in place. Well, to demonstrate the level of readiness of the system, I do not have the clear schedule like I would tell you, yes, 70% readiness. Unfortunately, we have limited resources. Maybe we could hire 20 best lawyers, 20 best economists, 20 best managers to organize our efforts, and then we would implement the full audit of all business processes, maybe offer some much better regulatory acts. I would tell you, it will take me 6 months to reform the Anti-Monopoly Committee, but under the circumstances, we are just moving forward. I have a quite critical attitude with regard to myself, but I believe there are good signs of improvement still. I hope so, at least. Any more questions, or shall we really conclude? Okay. My last answer was kind of a bridge to the concluding remarks. So first of all, I'd like to thank to Mr. Vlichenko, Tsivkish, Hasan Takai, all the members of the foundation, Competition Development Foundation. Actually, it's thanks to them that this event has been implemented at such a high level. I may try to say something rational, something very emotional. Well, my actually conclusions concerning these 2 days, that's a huge benefit indeed, because we've been able to concentrate without being distracted by our everyday activities, by these vertiginous and turbulent activities, but we had time to talk about really important things. We could draw attention not only of specialists, but we could draw attention of politicians, representatives of other ministries to our problems, to really ensure their buy-in, to make them understand that we're all in the same boat, and our success will not be possible without involving, engaging other persons, first of all our colleagues from other agencies and ministries. For sure, Besides identification of the major lines of our activities, conceptually, there are some practical things that we can really implement in practice quite quickly. For instance, I would mention the last session about compliance, some practical things that we talked about concerning the investigations, the concept for a whistleblower hotline, when you create incentives for the individuals to report violations. I think these are quite practical know-how that can be implemented. No doubt this forum is a benefit because of the organizational side, because we can say that it's like steering committee. Well, you see, we have recommendations, we have to comply, and we have to do it together. So the fact that we had here the Parliament representatives, Ministry of Economy and Trade, Ministry of Infrastructure, judicial representatives, that's very useful. And I think that's what we need to take advantage of within the month, probably, to put together a very practical action plan to make sure that this enthusiasm continues and we gain the impetus. The forum is also useful because of its social communicative function. What I am really impressed with, what I was impressed with when I became the head of anti-monopoly committee is, for me, it would be very difficult to imagine other area of activities which is so internationalized, where the relations, links between different agencies of different countries last for so long time, and where these links are so friendly, because we really appreciate assistance of our foreign partners, and certainly this constructive spirit of a friendly dialogue was really a big impression for me. I would even say surprise. You say it's public service, and I'm very happy with the fact that we can engage in this positive international cooperation. A lot of people here in Ukraine to enrich each other with our experience. And from the emotional side, of course, I would talk about my feeling of support, of what we are doing on the side of international organizations, our foreign partners, all those who are present in this room. On one side, this is about support. On the other side, this is, of course, about responsibility. So I want to thank you very much for your participation, for your sincere and candid interest with regard to these problems. And my personal feelings are not just thankfulness, but also my personal responsibility to all of you for implementation of everything that we have discussed. Thank you. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to summarize our discussions. Thank you for the words that you said. But I remember when Sergei Sivkach and I were actually creating this forum. Next year we have 7th forum. It certainly has now its own name, its own reputation. It now has its place even in the area of the competition policies. I remember I suggested even change of terminology, switching, making it rather Ukrainian than Russian. It's difficult to translate, unfortunately. But the forum is so interesting also because if you realize the head of the AMC have spent all 2 days, the full days with us, you understand how busy this person is. It's hard to imagine for me how he could really get rid of all these meetings in the presidential administration, with the cabinet of ministers, or whatever. So another important point is that we had here many other employees of the committee. This forum would not be possible with them. They certainly invested their hearts and their souls into this forum, and so we could look at the full spectrum of the related problems. We talked about OECD recommendations and review, and judicial reform, and state aid, and public procurement, and natural monopolies, and finally compliance arising from Article 33 on protection against unfair competition. I remember my first draft as of 1996, where we wrote that the businesses would develop the rules of competitive activities, and that was actually only the first roots. And now we can see absolutely a different level of approach to this problem. So talking with responsibility, I would say that now the Anti-Monopoly Committee is ready to start. It took time to really get in depth of the problem, say no. Whatever genius you are, you cannot come to an office and to master after a month or two all these cornerstones of competition policy and many other things related to this. So now I want to wish to all these people to make all your plans and dreams true. Certainly, you can criticize them every day, you can blame them for many mistakes, as it was done with the former members of the committee. I think here we are former members of the committee, and I'm not ashamed for what we did. I know we have now the new team, and we know that when a leader becomes a leader, first day, the manager, he or she needs to think about the last day of his career, and so to think about the further improvement of his or her agency. On behalf of Sergei, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank our administrative team, which actually made it all happen. And it was very good quality, good level at this forum. I want to wish you good health, good luck. We are always open for the cooperation. And as you can see now, our brand is becomes more and more famous. We are ready to cooperate with businesses and with everybody. Thank you very much.